The bright morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Boston Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Michael Patterson adjusted his black robes as he walked through the private corridor leading to courtroom 4. At 52 years old, with grained temples and stern blue eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent the last 5 years making decisions that impacted people's lives. "Another busy Monday," he muttered to his court clerk, Sarah, as she handed him the day's docket. There were 23 cases to hear before lunch, mostly traffic violations and minor disputes. Judge Patterson was known throughout Boston's legal community for running a tight ship. He took pride in how quickly and efficiently he moved through cases, though some lawyers whispered that he was too harsh, especially with repeat offenders. The old courthouse building hummed with activity as people filed into the courtroom. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of nervous defendants, busy lawyers, and curious onlookers. The smell of coffee and winter coats filled the air, mixing with the familiar scent of old books and furniture polish that seemed permanent in these historic halls. Sarah called the court to order at exactly 9:00 a.m. All rise. The Municipal Court of Boston is now in session, the Honorable Judge Michael Patterson presiding. Judge Patterson entered with measured steps and took his seat behind the elevated bench. From this position, he could see everyone in his courtroom. He liked that. Control and order were everything to him, and he made sure everyone knew it. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. He began working through the morning cases with mechanical efficiency. A speeding ticket, guilty, $200 fine. An illegal parking dispute, dismissed with warning. A noise complaint, resolved with a small fine and stern lecture about respecting neighbors. By 11:30 a.m., Judge Patterson was starting to feel the strain of the morning. His back ached from sitting in the same position, and his patience was wearing thin. The coffee on his desk had gone cold hours ago, and his mood matched the bitter liquid. "Next case," he called out, rubbing his temples. Sarah's voice rang out clear and professional. "Docket number 247, City of Boston versus Washington, parking violation at 145 Commonwealth Avenue." Judge Patterson glanced at the file in front of him. It was a simple case. Parking in a restricted zone, a common offense in the busy streets around the universities. He expected it to take no more than 5 minutes, like most parking violations. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the defendant walked in. Dr. Eleanor Washington moved with quiet confidence through the aisle. She wore a charcoal gray suit and carried a leather briefcase, looking more like a corporate lawyer than someone contesting a parking ticket. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back neatly, and her wire-rimmed glasses gave her an intellectual air. What Judge Patterson couldn't know yet, was that this seemingly routine case would soon shake the very foundations of his career and self-image. He didn't recognize the woman standing before him, though he should have. He didn't notice how the few lawyers present in the courtroom straightened in their seats when she entered, or the respectful nods they gave her. "State your name for the record," Judge Patterson said, not looking up from his papers. "Dr. Eleanor Washington," she replied, her voice clear and measured. "You're contesting a parking violation from October 15th, he stated, still scanning the document. "The fine is $100. Do you understand the charge?" "Yes, Your Honor," Dr. Washington responded. "However, I believe there are some important factors to consider regarding the signage at that location." Judge Patterson finally looked up, his expression already showing signs of impatience. Here was another person trying to waste his time with excuses, or so he thought. He had no idea that the next few minutes would become a turning point in his life, a moment that would be discussed in law schools and judicial training programs for years to come. The morning sun had moved higher now, and the courthouse was warming up. The old radiators clanked and hissed in the background. In the quiet tension of courtroom 4, a story was about to unfold that would force one man to confront his deepest biases and change the way he saw the world. Dr. Eleanor Washington opened her briefcase and took out a folder containing photographs and documents. As dean of Harvard Law School, she was used to being prepared for everything. Today was no different. Even if it was just a parking ticket, she believed in practicing what she taught her students. Every legal matter, no matter how small, deserved proper attention. The courtroom's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she arranged her evidence on the small wooden table before her. A few drops of rain began hitting the tall windows, creating a soft pattern of sounds in the background. Dr. Washington had almost skipped this hearing. She had a busy day ahead with faculty meetings and a lecture to deliver. But something inside her said this was important. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and professional, "I have documentation showing that the parking signs at 145 Commonwealth Avenue were partially hidden by overgrown tree branches on the day in question." She pulled out several clear photographs that showed exactly what she was describing. Judge Patterson drummed his fingers on his desk impatiently. He had already handled 16 cases this morning, and his mind was on the lunch appointment he was likely to be late for. "Ms. Washington," he interrupted, emphasizing the Ms., even though she had clearly stated her title was Doctor. "We see these kinds of excuses every day." Dr. Washington kept her composure, though she noticed his deliberate dismissal of her title. After 30 years in academia and law, she was familiar with such subtle forms of disrespect. "Your Honor, if you would please look at the evidence." "The sign has been in that location for 10 years. Judge Patterson cut in again, his voice growing harder. "Every other driver seems to manage just fine." He shuffled some papers on his desk, clearly indicating he considered the matter settled. From the back of the courtroom, a young law student who was observing court proceedings that day watched with growing discomfort. He recognized Dr. Washington immediately. She had given the welcome speech at his law school orientation just 2 months ago. He couldn't believe the way the judge was treating one of the most respected legal scholars in the country. Dr. Washington took a deep breath. She thought about all the times she had told her students about the importance of standing up for what's right, even in small matters. "Your Honor, I understand the court's time is valuable. However, due process requires that." "Due process?" Judge Patterson's voice rose slightly. "This is a simple parking violation, not a constitutional law seminar." He didn't notice how several lawyers in the courtroom exchanged knowing looks at his unfortunate choice of words. Constitutional law was, after all, Dr. Washington's specialty, and her textbook sat on the shelves of every law school in the country. The rain outside grew heavier, matching the darkening mood in the courtroom. Dr. Washington remained standing, her dignity intact despite the judge's dismissive attitude. She thought about her own journey, from a small town in Georgia to becoming the first black woman to serve as dean of Harvard Law School. She had faced much worse than this. "I have been a licensed attorney for over 30 years, she said calmly, "and I understand the difference between a constitutional law matter and a parking violation. I am simply requesting that the court examine the evidence." "That's enough." Judge Patterson's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Your attitude is not helping your case, Ms. Washington." Again, the deliberate dismissal of her title hung in the air. The young law student in the back row pulled out his phone and silently typed a message to his classmates. Within minutes, several more law students quietly entered the courtroom, drawn by the unfolding situation. Dr. Washington stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She had handled difficult situations throughout her career by staying calm and professional. This would be no different. She watched as Judge Patterson scribbled something on her file, his face set in stone. What neither of them knew was that this moment would soon become a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire Boston legal community. The rain continued to fall outside, and the old courthouse creaked and settled, as if it too was waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in courtroom 4 grew thicker as Judge Patterson picked up his gavel. The sound of rain against the windows had become stronger, matching the storm brewing inside. More law students continued to slip quietly into the back rows, their phones held low as they texted updates to their classmates. "Ms. Washington," Judge Patterson said, still refusing to use her proper title, "your continued arguments are becoming disruptive to this court." He shuffled through some papers on his desk, not bothering to look at the evidence she had tried to present. Dr. Washington stood straight, her expression calm despite the unfair treatment. She thought about all the times she had told her students that the law was about justice, not just rules. Now, those same lessons were being tested in real time. "Your Honor," she tried one more time, her voice steady and clear, "I have photographs showing that the parking sign was completely hidden by branches on that day. Even the parking enforcement officer who wrote the ticket admitted this in his notes." The young law students in the back of the courtroom exchanged glances. They had all taken Dr. Washington's constitutional law class. They knew her reputation for being fair, prepared, and always professional. Seeing her treated this way made them uncomfortable, but they also knew they were watching something important unfold. Judge Patterson's face turned slightly red. "Ms. Washington, I don't appreciate you trying to lecture me about parking regulations. This is my courtroom, and I've heard enough excuses today." He tapped his pen against the desk impatiently. Sarah, the court clerk, watched the scene with growing concern. In her 5 years working with Judge Patterson, she had never seen him quite this dismissive of a defendant who was so clearly prepared and professional. Dr. Washington opened her briefcase again and pulled out another document. "I have also brought a statement from the city's Public Works Department," she said calmly. "They confirmed that the tree branches were trimmed the day after I received this ticket, specifically because they were blocking the sign." A few whispers spread through the courtroom. Even Sarah raised her eyebrows. This was solid evidence that any reasonable judge would want to consider. But Judge Patterson's expression only hardened. "Enough," he snapped, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. "Your persistent arguing is showing contempt for this court. I will not have it." His hand tightened around his gavel. Dr. Washington remained composed, though her eyes showed a flash of disappointment. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice and teaching future lawyers about the importance of fair hearings. Now she was experiencing firsthand what many of her students had told her about: the way justice sometimes failed at the most basic levels. The rain outside suddenly grew louder, and a crack of thunder made several people jump. The old courthouse lights flickered briefly, creating a dramatic moment that seemed to match the tension in the room. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington said quietly, "I need to return to the law school soon. I have a faculty meeting at 1 o'clock that I must chair." She glanced at her watch, hoping to move things along. Judge Patterson barely registered her words at first. He was too busy writing in his notes, preparing to deliver what he thought would be a lesson in respect to this difficult defendant. But somewhere in the back of his mind, something about her words caught his attention. Law school? Faculty meeting? Before he could process this thought, his anger took over again. "Well, Ms. Washington, your schedule is not this court's concern. In fact, your entire attitude today has been unacceptable." He straightened in his chair, preparing to deliver his judgment. The law students in the background were now filming discreetly on their phones. They knew their dean would never recommend recording in court, but they also knew they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. Sarah watched as Judge Patterson's face grew more stern. She wanted to say something, to point out that this defendant was different, that maybe he should listen. But court procedures and years of habit kept her silent. She began preparing the paperwork for what she knew would be a harsh fine. The old courthouse creaked in the storm, its wooden beams and floors groaning with age. In just a few moments, everything in this room would change. Judge Patterson was about to learn a lesson far more valuable than the one he thought he was teaching. Judge Patterson lifted his gavel, his face stern with what he thought was righteous authority. The sound of rain hammering against the courthouse windows created a tense backdrop to the scene about to unfold. "Due to your disrespectful behavior and continued disruption of this court," he announced loudly, "I am imposing the maximum fine of $500. His voice carried across the now-packed courtroom. "Perhaps this will teach you the importance of respecting the law and this court's authority." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even Sarah, the court clerk, looked shocked. The regular fine for a parking violation was only $100. Everyone knew this punishment was excessive, but no one dared speak up. Dr. Washington stood quietly, her expression unchanged. In her 30 years of legal experience, she had seen many examples of injustice. She knew this moment would become another teaching example for her students, though not in the way Judge Patterson intended. Furthermore, the judge continued, growing more confident with his decision, "I'm adding a $50 court fee for wasting our time with these unnecessary arguments." He wrote the amounts in his ledger with sharp, angry strokes of his pen. The young law students in the back of the courtroom were now sending rapid text messages to their classmates. One of them quietly slipped out, heading straight for the law school building just a few blocks away. The story of what was happening to their dean was spreading quickly. Dr. Washington opened her briefcase one final time. She pulled out her checkbook, her movements deliberate and dignified. The sound of her pen scratching against the check seemed unusually loud in the tense silence of the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said calmly, writing the check for $550, "I will pay this fine under protest. However, I would like the record to show that I was denied the opportunity to present valid evidence in my defense. Judge Patterson's face reddened even more. Are you questioning my judgment? He demanded, leaning forward in his chair. The windows rattled with another crack of thunder, as if emphasizing his anger. No, Your Honor, Dr. Washington replied softly. I am merely exercising my right to make a statement for the record. As someone who has taught civil procedure for 20 years, I believe it's important to. Taught civil procedure? Judge Patterson interrupted, but this time there was a slight change in his tone. Something about those words nagged at his memory. He looked more closely at the woman standing before him. Dr. Washington continued calmly, Yes, Your Honor. At Harvard Law School, where I currently serve as. But before she could finish, a group of people hurried into the courtroom. Among them was Professor James Chen, one of Judge Patterson's old law school teachers who now served on the state's Judicial Review Board. He had been having lunch in the courthouse cafeteria when a breathless law student found him and told him what was happening. Judge Patterson's face began to change as he watched Professor Chen take a seat in the front row. Something wasn't right. He looked back at Dr. Washington, really seeing her for the first time. There was something familiar about her face, something that brought back memories of his law school days 15 years ago. Sarah noticed the change in the judge's expression. She had worked with him long enough to know when something was bothering him. She watched as he picked up Dr. Washington's case file again, this time reading it more carefully. Dr. Washington walked forward to hand her check to Sarah. As she did, the sunlight briefly broke through the storm clouds outside, illuminating her face. Judge Patterson's hand froze in midair as he was about to bang his gavel one final time. The moment of recognition was approaching, but it hadn't quite arrived. The old courthouse grew eerily quiet, except for the steady drum of rain and the soft shuffling of feet as more people crowded into the courtroom. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Judge Patterson's world was about to turn upside down. The revelation that would shake his confidence and change his entire perspective was just seconds away. All his years on the bench had not prepared him for what he was about to discover. The moment of recognition hit Judge Patterson like a bolt of lightning. His face turned from red to ghostly white in seconds as memories from 15 years ago suddenly flooded back. The woman standing before him wasn't just any law professor. She was Professor Eleanor Washington, the same professor who had written his recommendation letter for his first judicial appointment. Professor Washington, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The gavel in his hand trembled slightly. Dr. Washington looked directly at him, her eyes carrying years of wisdom and experience. Actually, Your Honor, it's Dean Washington now. I've been serving as Dean of Harvard Law School for the past 3 years. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Judge Patterson's hands began to shake as he remembered sitting in her constitutional law class, where she had taught him about the importance of fair hearings and equal justice. Now he had just fined her unfairly and treated her with obvious bias. Sarah, the court clerk, watched as the color drained from Judge Patterson's face. She had never seen him look so shaken. The papers in front of him slipped from his trembling fingers, scattering across his desk. I didn't. Judge Patterson struggled to find words. His mind raced back to all the times Dean Washington had stayed late after class to help him understand difficult legal concepts. She had believed in him when other professors had doubted his abilities. Professor Chen stood up from his seat in the front row. Michael, he said quietly, using the judge's first name, I think we need to take a brief recess. His voice was kind but firm, carrying the weight of his position on the Judicial Review Board. The young law students in the back of the courtroom watched with wide eyes as their usually confident dean stood quietly, her check still held out toward Sarah. One student whispered to another, This is going to be in every legal ethics textbook next year. Judge Patterson looked down at the fine he had just imposed. $550 for a simple parking violation. The same violation that usually resulted in a $100 fine or often just a warning. His own bias had been exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. Dean Washington, he finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly, please accept my deepest. But before he could finish his apology, she raised her hand gently to stop him. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying the same patient tone she used when teaching difficult lessons to her students. Perhaps we could schedule a follow-up hearing. one where both the evidence and the law can be properly considered. Her words were careful, offering him a professional way to correct his mistake. The rain outside had finally stopped, and a beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, streaming through the tall courthouse windows. It illuminated the scene like a spotlight on a stage, highlighting this moment of truth and transformation. Professor Chen walked forward to the bench. Judge Patterson, I believe Dean Washington's suggestion is excellent. It would also give us an opportunity to discuss some broader issues regarding judicial process. The implied meaning was clear. This incident would not be ignored. Judge Patterson looked around his courtroom. He saw the faces of the law students, many of whom he now realized were Dean Washington's current students. He saw Sarah's concerned expression, Professor Chen's stern but understanding look, and finally, Dean Washington's dignified stance. "Court is in recess," he announced, his voice barely steady. "Dean Washington, please keep your check for now. We will reconvene for a new hearing next week." He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste to retreat to his chambers. As he hurried through his private door, Judge Patterson could hear the murmur of voices rising in the courtroom behind him. His hands were still shaking as he closed his office door. He walked to his window and looked out at the clearing sky, knowing that his world had just changed forever. The old grandfather clock in his chambers ticked loudly in the silence, marking each second of this pivotal moment. Judge Patterson sat heavily in his leather chair, realizing that the real lesson today had been taught to him, not by him. Inside his chambers, Judge Patterson sat at his desk with his head in his hands. The events of the past hour played over and over in his mind like a bad movie he couldn't stop. The beautiful wooden office that had always been his place of pride now felt suffocating. A gentle knock on his door made him look up. "Come in," he said weakly, expecting to see Sarah with more paperwork. Instead, Professor Chen entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the courthouse cafe. "I thought you might need this," Professor Chen said, placing 1 cup on the desk. The steam rose slowly in the quiet room, carrying the strong smell of French roast coffee. Judge Patterson couldn't even look at his old teacher. "James, I made a terrible mistake," he whispered. His judicial robe felt heavy on his shoulders now, like a weight he wasn't sure he deserved to carry anymore. Professor Chen took a seat across from him. "Yes, you did," he agreed simply. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" He sipped his coffee, watching his former student struggle with the reality of what had happened. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Dean Washington stood surrounded by her law students. They were angry on her behalf, but she raised her hand to quiet their protests. "This is a teaching moment," she told them firmly. "What happened in there is exactly why we spend so much time discussing implicit bias in our classes." Her calm voice carried the wisdom of someone who had faced such situations many times before. Back in his chambers, Judge Patterson opened his computer with shaking hands. "I need to see it," he said, mostly to himself. He pulled up the courtroom's security footage and began to watch his own behavior from just an hour ago. Professor Chen sat quietly as the judge watched himself on screen. They both saw how he had interrupted Dean Washington repeatedly, how he had dismissed her evidence without looking at it, how he had refused to use her proper title. "Oh God," Judge Patterson groaned, putting his face in his hands again. "I'd become everything I promised myself I wouldn't be." He remembered writing his judicial oath, swearing to be fair and impartial to all who entered his courtroom. A message popped up on his computer screen, an email from the Boston Legal Times requesting a comment about the incident. Word was spreading fast through the legal community. "The reporters are already calling," he said, his voice hollow. "My career is over." Professor Chen leaned forward. "It doesn't have to be," he said thoughtfully. "This could be an opportunity, Michael. A chance to make real change, not just in your courtroom but in the whole system." In the courthouse cafeteria, Dean Washington sat with a cup of tea, reviewing her notes from the hearing. Despite everything that had happened, she was already thinking about how to use this experience to improve the legal system. Sarah, the court clerk, approached Dean Washington's table nervously. "Dean Washington, I should have said something during the hearing. I knew he was being unfair." Dean Washington smiled kindly at the young clerk. "Sometimes the hardest part of justice is speaking up when we see something wrong," she said. "That's why we need to create systems where everyone feels safe doing so." Back in the judge's chambers, Professor Chen was still talking. You have two choices, Michael. You can hide from this, maybe even resign, or you can face it head-on and work to make things better. Judge Patterson looked at his reflection in his computer screen. He saw the lines of worry on his face, the gray in his hair, and most importantly, the shame in his eyes. But then he remembered something Dean Washington had taught him years ago in law school. The measure of justice is not in never making mistakes, but in how we correct them when we do. He straightened up in his chair. I need to make this right, he said firmly. Not just with Dean Washington, but with everyone who comes into my courtroom. Professor Chen nodded approvingly. That's the student I remember, he said. Now, let's talk about how we can turn this mistake into meaningful change. Outside, the sun had fully broken through the clouds, filling the old courthouse with warm light. In different corners of the building, 3 people, a judge, a dean, and a professor, were all thinking about the same thing: how to turn this difficult moment into a force for positive change in the justice system. 1 week later, courtroom 4 was packed with people: law students, local attorneys, and even a few reporters sat quietly in the wooden benches, waiting for the special hearing to begin. The morning sun shone through the tall windows, making the dust particles dance in the air. Judge Patterson stood in his chambers, adjusting his black robe. His hands were steady now, but his heart was beating fast. He had spent the entire week preparing for this moment. On his desk lay a stack of papers, the results of his review of every fine and decision he had made in the past year. It's time, Your Honor, Sarah said softly from the doorway. She had noticed a big change in the judge over the past week. He seemed more thoughtful, more careful with his words and actions. In the hallway outside, Dean Washington walked beside Professor Chen. She carried the same folder of evidence from the parking ticket case, but today it was joined by something else: proposal for a new judicial training program. Are you ready for this? Professor Chen asked her. Dean Washington nodded. Change only happens when we're brave enough to face uncomfortable truths, she replied. Several of her students walked behind her, proud to witness this important moment. Judge Patterson entered the courtroom. All rise, Sarah announced, her voice clear and strong. But before anyone could sit down, the judge raised his hand. Please remain standing for a moment, he said. His voice was different from before, more humble, more human. Before we begin today's hearing, I have something important to say. The room fell completely silent. Even the old courthouse seemed to hold its breath. Last week in this courtroom, I failed in my duty as a judge, he began. I allowed my biases to affect my judgment. I treated Dr. Eleanor Washington, Dean of Harvard Law School, with disrespect and imposed an unfair fine without reviewing her evidence. He paused, looking directly at Dean Washington. But my failure that day wasn't just about one case. After reviewing my records, I discovered a disturbing pattern in my decisions. Minorities and women in my courtroom have consistently received harsher penalties than others for the same offenses. A murmur ran through the crowd. No one had expected such honest admission. Today, I'm not just overturning the fine I imposed on Dean Washington, Judge Patterson continued. I'm announcing 3 major changes in this court. He picked up a document from his bench. First, I have requested an independent review of all my decisions from the past 5 years. Second, I will be requiring myself and all court staff to undergo comprehensive bias training. Dean Washington watched quietly, her expression thoughtful. She had seen many powerful people apologize before, but rarely had she seen one take such concrete action to create change. And third, Judge Patterson said, his voice growing stronger, I am working with Dean Washington and Professor Chen to establish a new program. Every month, law students will observe our court proceedings and provide feedback on any signs of bias they notice. The young law students in the room sat up straighter, realizing they would play an important role in this change. Now, he said, picking up Dean Washington's original case file, we will hear the parking violation case again. This time, we will review all evidence properly and fairly. As the hearing began, Sarah noticed tears in the eyes of an elderly black woman sitting in the back row. Later, she learned the woman was a retired court clerk who had worked in this building for 40 years. Dean Washington presented her evidence calmly and clearly, just as she had tried to do the week before. This time, Judge Patterson listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and reviewed each photograph and document. To no one's surprise, he dismissed the parking ticket based on the evidence of the obscured sign. But everyone knew that today's hearing was about much more than a simple parking violation. As the morning sun reached its peak, streaming bright light through the courthouse windows, something new was beginning. In courtroom 4, a small piece of the justice system was being transformed, all because one judge had the courage to face his mistakes and work to correct them. 6 months later, the old courthouse looked different. Not in its physical appearance, the same wooden benches still creaked, and the tall windows still lit in the morning sun, but in the way justice was served inside its walls. Judge Patterson sat in his office, reviewing the latest report from the bias monitoring program. On his wall hung a new plaque that read, "Justice sees no colors, only truth." Below it sat a framed photograph from last month's judicial training graduation ceremony, showing him standing proudly with Dean Washington and 20 other judges who had completed the new program. A knock on his door made him look up. Sarah entered with the morning's court schedule and a copy of the Harvard Law Review. "You might want to see this, Your Honor," she said with a smile, opening the journal to a specific page. The article was titled, "Transforming Justice: How One Court's Mistake Led to Systemic Change." It was written by Dean Washington, describing how a simple parking ticket case had sparked a revolution in the Boston municipal court system. In her office at Harvard Law School, Dean Washington was meeting with representatives from other cities who wanted to implement similar programs in their courtrooms. The parking ticket incident had become a case study taught in law schools across the country. The most powerful lesson, she told the visitors, wasn't about one judge's bias. It was about how we can transform our mistakes into opportunities for real change. Her words were being recorded for a documentary about judicial reform. Back in courtroom 4, the morning session was about to begin. The room looked different now. A diverse group of law students sat in designated seats around the courtroom, each with a special form to document their observations about the proceedings. Their presence had become a normal part of the court's daily operation. Judge Patterson entered the courtroom, but before Sarah could announce him, he noticed a familiar face in the back row. Professor Chen had come to observe, just as he did occasionally to see how this former student was doing. "All rise," Sarah announced. "The Municipal Court of Boston is now in session, the Honorable Judge Michael Patterson presiding." The judge took his seat and looked out at the crowded courtroom. He saw faces of all colors, backgrounds, and walks of life. Each person would get the same careful attention, the same respect, the same justice. He had made sure of that. A young black woman approached the bench for her case. 6 months ago, Judge Patterson might have rushed through her hearing. Today, he listened carefully to her story about a disputed traffic ticket, asked thoughtful questions, and reviewed all her evidence before making his decision. During the lunch break, Judge Patterson walked to the law school where Dean Washington was giving a special lecture titled, "When Justice Learns: The Power of Accountability in Our Courts." He slipped quietly into the back of the lecture hall. Dean Washington was showing the students statistics from the past 6 months. The data revealed a remarkable change. The racial and gender disparities in fines and sentences had nearly disappeared in Judge Patterson's courtroom. Other judges who had gone through the program showed similar improvements. After the lecture, Dean Washington spotted him in the back. "Good to see you, Michael," she said warmly. They had moved past the formality of titles months ago. "Ready for tomorrow's training session?" Judge Patterson nodded. He now helped teach the bias awareness program to other judges, sharing his story as a warning and an inspiration. "You know," he said, "that parking ticket was the most expensive and valuable lesson of my career." Dean Washington smiled. "Sometimes the most important changes come from unexpected moments," she replied. "The key is being willing to learn from them." As they walked back to the courthouse together, they passed a newly installed sign on Commonwealth Avenue. It was clearly visible, properly maintained, and symbolized something much bigger than parking regulations. It represented how small changes could lead to greater justice. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Judge Patterson returned to his courtroom. He touched the small note he kept on his bench, hidden from view. It read, "Listen first, judge second." These simple words had become his daily reminder. Sarah watched him take his seat, remembering the angry judge from 6 months ago. That man was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that true justice requires constant growth, honest self-reflection, and the courage to change.